Hi, this is Professor Charlie Evans, and I'm going to say a few words about the gathering of lands, the expansion and growth of Moscow in the Middle Ages, from a very small principality to eventually a kingdom and an empire. Um, One of the first things that I'd note is that the growth of Moscow is very similar to the early expansion of France, specifically under the Capetian dynasty. When Hugh Capet became the first king of France, his territory was really the amount of land around Paris itself. And this is very similar to the situation in Moscow. And as the Capetian dynasty continued, he gradually expanded his territorial control. The kind of factors that allowed him to expand in France were hereditary, the support of the church, the central location of Paris. And these are similar factors that explain the rise of Moscow in the Middle Ages. The central location, a little bit insulated against invasions, unlike territories to the south of Moscow or to the west of Moscow, which were more subject to attacks from the Swedes, Lithuania, and the Tatars or Mongols to the south. So the location of Moscow in kind of a more protected northeastern area of France. Hereditary, the fact for a relatively long period of time, the Muscovite rulers were able to pass the control of their territory to a son. There was often disputes over who that son should be and familial things. But for the most part, the Russian rulers were pretty lucky and able to establish the rule of hereditary succession to the throne. And then, of course, the support of the church. The Metropolitan of the Russian Orthodox Church was located in Moscow, and the support of the church was very important as Moscow began to expand in size. Of course, the fourth factor would be that after the Mongol invasions devastated much of Russia, the Mongols didn't directly control portions of Russia, and they gave to the Grand Prince of Moscow something called the Yarlik, and this was basically the enforcement uh, tax collecting and enforcement operations of the Mongols. So the Mongols didn't really control Moscow itself. They let Moscow alone and said, as long as you collect taxes and as long as you agree to our rule, everything will be fine. And so that was really important for the Muscovite rulers to have that kind of authority. Um, so that's four factors promoting the rise of Moscow in the Middle Ages. The other factor, of course, if I'm going to name something, would be the competence of the Russian rulers, whether it be Ivan or Vasily or Daniel or Dmitri. And sure, the names get complicated. There's a lot of Ivans, there's a lot of Vasilis. But for the most part, the rulers proved to be very competent. They effectively led their armies. They effectively administered their states, as much as you could call effective in the Middle Ages. And so that was another plus. And so after the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, the Mongols dominated much of southern Russia and really imposed their rule on Russia. But like I said earlier, they didn't physically control much of Russian territory that was left to Moscow, which was gradually expanded over time. The key really became under Ivan III and his capture and control of Novgorod in the 14th century that dramatically expanded Moscow, and it dramatically expanded especially westward. And so, in a way, much like with the expansion and growth of France in the early Middle Ages, the growth of Muscovite power through the Middle Ages was due to these different factors, and also, of course, due to luck. You had to be lucky. Things had to go Moscow's way, and even though Moscow was sacked numerous times by the Mongols in this period of time, they were still eventually able to come out in time. And it was in the reign of Ivan III, who finally adopted the title of Tsar of all Russias. And this kind of symbolized Russia arriving on a European scene as a European big power, as a powerful kingdom that existed in the eastern part of Europe. And so that's about it. If you have any questions, just give me a call, shoot me an email, and I'll see what I can do. Thanks. Bye.